The heavy clumps of dry dirt fell onto the top of my father's wooden coffin. I stood at the edge of the open grave, feeling the brutal heat of the New Mexico sun beating down on the back of my neck. I was wearing a black suit that was completely soaked with sweat. The preacher was standing across from me, holding a black Bible, speaking words about peace and eternal rest. I stared down into the hole in the ground and felt absolutely nothing but a cold, heavy shame. Everyone standing around me in that small desert cemetery thought I was the good son. They thought I was the loyal boy who had stayed behind to help his aging father run the family cattle ranch during the worst drought in 100 years. Family friends came up to me, shaking my hand, telling me my father was proud of me. They had no idea they were shaking the hand of a thief. They had no idea that I was the real reason the ranch was dying. I never cared about the spiritual world. I was a man who only believed in what I could see and touch. People talk about near-death experiences all the time on television, but I always thought those people were just looking for attention. I used to see videos online about powerful testimonies of people finding God, and I would immediately change the channel or close the app. I considered religion to be a crutch for weak people who could not handle the harsh reality of life. When people in my town shared Christian testimonies about how their lives were changed, I laughed at them behind their backs. I did not want anything to change. I liked my life exactly the way it was, even though my life was built entirely on a foundation of lies. I thought evangelical testimonies were just emotional stories designed to manipulate people into giving money to churches. I wanted to remain the master of my own destiny. I never realized that my destiny was a cliff, and I was driving straight toward it. My father was a hard-working man. He spent 50 years turning dry dirt into a profitable cattle business. When his health began to fail 2 years ago, he handed all the finances over to me. He trusted me completely. He gave me the keys to the bank accounts, the property deeds, and his own personal retirement fund. He told me to keep the family legacy alive, but I had a secret. I had an addiction to prescription painkillers that had completely taken over my brain. It started years ago after a minor back injury from working with the horses, but it slowly turned into a monster that dictated every single choice I made. The pills made me feel powerful. They made me feel numb to the stress of the failing ranch. Because I needed money to maintain my secret habit, I started stealing. At first, it was just small amounts from the ranch operating accounts. I would forge a receipt here and there, telling my father that the cost of cattle feed had gone up. But as my addiction grew, my theft grew. I started taking large amounts of money from his medical fund, while he was sitting in his chair in the living room, suffering in pain and worrying about how he was going to pay for his treatment. I was driving into the city to buy more pills with his money. I watched him stress over the bill. I watched him cry because he thought he was losing the ranch to the drought. He died looking out the window at the dry dirt, feeling like a failure. He never knew that the real failure was standing right behind him in the kitchen. I ruined him. I stole his peace. I stole his money, and I stole his legacy. Standing there at his funeral, listening to the preacher talk about heaven, I felt a deep, dark anger. I did not believe in heaven, and I certainly refused to believe in hell. I thought hell testimonies were completely ridiculous stories meant to scare children. I believed that when a person dies, their brain simply turns off, and they become nothing but dirt. That is exactly what I wanted. I wanted to be dirt. I wanted to disappear completely, so I would never have to face the massive mountain of guilt I had created. I looked down at the coffin and told myself that my secret was buried with him. The only person who could have ever discovered the missing money was now in a box under the ground. I thought I was safe. I thought my shame was buried forever. After the funeral ended, the guests went back to the main house for food, but I could not face them. My aunt stopped me by my truck and tried to hand me a book of impactful testimonies. She looked at me with kind eyes and told me the stories in the book would help heal my grieving heart. I forced a fake smile, thanked her, and threw the book onto the passenger seat of my truck. I had no intention of reading it. I just wanted everyone to leave me alone. I walked away from the crowd, changed out of my black suit, and put on my dirty work clothes and heavy leather boots. I needed to work. Physical labor was the only way I knew how to escape the noise in my head. Whenever the guilt became too loud, I would work until my muscles failed, using the physical pain to drown out the spiritual conviction. We had a broken water pump out in the Badlands, located at the very farthest edge of our property. The cattle out there were suffering from the lack of water. It was a job that needed to be done, and it was the perfect excuse to run away from my family. I got into my truck and drove out into the desert alone. The drive took 40 minutes over broken, rocky dirt roads. The landscape of New Mexico in the middle of summer is absolutely unforgiving. The sky was a pale, blinding white. The sun was beating down with intense aggression, baking the earth until it was hard as stone. There were no trees, only sharp bushes and dead grass. My truck kicked up a massive cloud of dust that hung in the air behind me. I was entirely isolated. There was no cell phone service out here. There was no one for miles in any direction. I wanted it that way. I hated myself, and I wanted to be as far away from humanity as possible. I arrived at the broken pump right in the middle of the afternoon. The heat was incredible. The air actually shimmered above the ground, making the distant rocks look distorted. I grabbed my heavy metal toolbox from the back of the truck and walked over to the well. The iron pipes of the pump were so hot, they burned my hands through my thick leather work gloves. I did not care. I welcomed the pain. I dropped to my knees in the dirt and started taking the heavy machinery apart. I focused all my mental energy on the bolts and the rusted metal. I pushed my body hard. I pulled on the heavy wrench with all my strength, using my anger and my shame as fuel. I wanted to exhaust myself so completely that I would not be able to think about my father's face when I went back to the empty house tonight. I worked without stopping for over an hour under the direct, punishing sun. Sweat was pouring down my face, stinging my eyes and soaking my shirt. My mouth was completely dry, tasting like dust and old iron. I reached out blindly for my plastic water bottle, but when I picked it up, it was entirely empty. I had forgotten to fill it at the house. I let out an angry breath and threw the empty bottle into the dirt. I wiped my forehead with the back of my dirty glove and prepared to stand up to get a different tool from the truck. That was when the first sensation hit me. It started as a strange, deep flutter right in the center of my chest. It did not feel like a normal heartbeat. It felt unnatural, like a trapped bird frantically beating its wings against the inside of my ribs. I stopped moving. I stayed on my knees in the dirt, waiting for the feeling to pass. I assumed I was just dehydrated. I told myself it was the heat and the stress of the day. I took a slow, deep breath of the hot desert air, trying to calm myself down. But the fluttering did not stop. Instead, it suddenly transformed into a massive, crushing pressure. It felt as though an invisible, incredibly heavy weight had been dropped directly onto my chest. The air was violently forced out of my lungs in a sharp gasp. I tried to pull oxygen back in, but my throat completely tightened. My lungs refused to expand. A terrible, freezing pain exploded behind my ribs. It was a sharp, clinical agony that radiated immediately up into my jaw and shot down my left arm. My fingers went completely numb, and the heavy metal wrench slipped out of my hand, hitting the dirt with a dull thud. I tried to stand up, desperate to reach the truck. I needed to turn on the air conditioning. I needed to sit down, but my legs were completely useless. My knees buckled instantly, and I collapsed forward onto the hard, baked earth. I landed heavily on my side. The hot dirt scraped against my cheek, and a cloud of red dust rose up around my face. Panic consumed me instantly. The tough, independent persona I had built for myself shattered into a million pieces. I was lying in the dirt, completely paralyzed by the pain, unable to breathe. I stared at the large tire of my truck, which was only a few feet away, but it might as well have been a million miles away. I tried to reach my hand out toward it, but my muscles refused to obey my brain. My body was completely shutting down, and I had absolutely no control over it. I tried to scream. I opened my mouth, desperate for help, but no sound came out. The silence of the desert was absolute and terrifying. There was no wind. There were no birds. There was only the brutal sun and the dry earth. I realized with absolute horror that no one knew I was out here. My brother had told me he was going to come look for me later in the evening, but that was hours away. I was completely alone, and I was going to die right here in the dirt. My vision began to change. The bright, blinding white light of the desert sun started to dim, fading into a cold, dark gray. A thick black shadow began to close in around the edges of my sight, narrowing my vision down to a small circle. The intense physical pain in my chest started to feel distant, but it was quickly replaced by something infinitely worse. A wave of pure, concentrated terror washed over my mind. This was not just a fear of dying. This was a deep, spiritual dread. It was the horrific realization that the physical world was ending, and I was not prepared for what was coming next. In those final seconds of consciousness, every lie I had ever told stood up in my mind. The wall I had built to hide my guilt completely collapsed. I saw my father's face. I saw the stolen money. I saw the exact moments I had chosen my addiction over my family. I had spent my entire life trying to bury my shame, running from the truth, hiding behind a fake smile and hard work. But as my physical body failed, the truth rushed to the surface, and I could not run away anymore. I stared at the red dirt inches from my eyes. I felt my chest stop completely. The beating bird inside my ribs gave one final violent kick, and then it went completely still. The breath left my lungs in a long, quiet release. The transition out of my body was instantaneous. I did not float up into the sky. I did not see a tunnel of bright light. I did not feel any sense of peace or comfort. Instead, I felt a violent, aggressive pull, pulling me straight down. The solid ground beneath my body suddenly lost its physical substance. I felt my awareness, my mind, and my very soul dragged forcefully down through the dirt. The bright desert disappeared. The heat of the sun vanished. I was falling rapidly into an absolute suffocating darkness, leaving the physical world behind, pulled downward by the unbearable weight of my own secret sins. The transition from the blinding light of the desert to absolute blackness was instant. I was no longer lying on the hard dirt next to my broken water pump. The physical world was completely gone. I felt an incredible force pulling me downward. It was as if the ground beneath me had opened up and swallowed me whole. I was falling fast, plunging into a deep, freezing darkness. The intense heat of the New Mexico sun was replaced by a cold, dry chill that sank right into my soul. I tried to reach out and grab something, anything to stop my fall. But there was nothing to hold on to. There was only empty space and the terrifying sensation of dropping into an endless pit. I expected to hit a bottom. I expected to crash into solid rock. But that never happened. Instead, the empty space around me suddenly changed. I stopped falling, but I did not land on a surface. I plunged directly into a massive, shifting ocean of dry sand. It hit me from every side all at once. The impact was heavy and suffocating. The sand completely engulfed me, instantly filling my eyes, my ears, and my nose. The absolute darkness remained, but now it was a darkness that had physical weight. My immediate human instinct was to panic and thrash my arms. I tried to swim upward, desperately trying to break the surface and find air. I kicked my legs and pushed with my hands, but the sand was too thick. It was not like water. It offered no leverage. Every time I tried to push upward, the heavy grains simply shifted and collapsed around me, pulling me deeper into the abyss. I was trapped inside a solid mountain of dirt, completely buried alive. The physical panic was overwhelming. My lungs were burning, screaming for oxygen. I clamped my mouth shut, terrified to take a breath. I knew that if I inhaled, I would fill my lungs with the dry, abrasive dirt. I held my breath until my chest felt like it was going to explode. The pain was unbearable. Finally, my body betrayed me. My mouth forced itself open in a desperate gasp for air, but there was no air. A thick rush of dry, coarse sand poured directly down my throat and into my lungs. It scraped against my windpipe, raw and painful. I choked violently. I tried to cough it out, but coughing only forced more sand deep into my chest. The feeling of suffocating on dry dirt is a nightmare I cannot fully describe. My lungs were completely packed with heavy, dry earth. I was drowning in the dust. In the physical world, a person would die within minutes in this situation. The brain would shut down from lack of oxygen, and the suffering would end. but I quickly realized a horrifying truth. I was no longer in a physical body that could die. I was a spirit, completely conscious and fully awake. I was choking on the sand, experiencing the exact physical agony of suffocation, but the release of death never came. I was forced to endure the absolute climax of drowning in dirt, continuously, without ever passing out. The pain of suffocation was frozen in time, repeating every single second. The weight of the sand pressing against me was unbelievable. It felt as though an entire desert had been dumped directly on top of me. The pressure squeezed my arms against my sides and locked my legs together. I could not move a single inch. I was entirely paralyzed by the sheer mass of the earth surrounding me. The claustrophobia was a living terror. I was wrapped tight in a heavy, abrasive blanket of darkness. As the reality of my situation set in, the nature of the sand began to change. I started to understand that this environment was not just a random punishment. It was a perfect, terrifying reflection of my own life. The sand pressing against me did not just feel like dirt anymore. It felt like the lies I had told. Every single grain of sand scratching against my skin represented a secret I had kept. I had spent my entire adult life trying to bury my shame. I had taken the stolen money from my dying father and buried the evidence in fake bank statements. I had taken my addiction to painkillers and buried it deep inside my own mind, hiding it behind a fake smile and hard physical labor on the ranch. I thought I was so clever. I thought I could dig a hole deep enough to hide my sins from the world and from God. Now, I was experiencing the terrible harvest of my own actions. I had chosen to live a life of burial, and now I was buried. The very dirt I had used to hide my guilt was now my eternal prison. I remembered the small white pills I used to swallow to escape my reality. I used to take them and feel a wave of numbness wash over me. I loved that numbness. I loved ignoring the problems of the ranch and the pain of my father. I thought those pills were my salvation. But now, as I swallowed the dry, bitter sand, I realized the sand was exactly like the pills. I had fed my soul dirt for years, and now dirt was all I had left. The temporary numbness of my addiction had traded away my eternal peace. I had sold my soul for a few hours of chemical silence, and the price was an eternity of choking on dust. The absolute isolation was crushing. I was surrounded by millions of tons of sand, but I was entirely alone. There were no other voices. There were no demons shouting at me. There was only the awful, dry sound of the sand shifting and grinding against my ears. I could not see my own hands. I could not even see the darkness itself, because my eyes were packed full of dirt. I was completely cut off from everything except my own mind. In that silent, heavy darkness, my mind became my greatest enemy. With nothing else to focus on, my memories began to play with sharp, aggressive clarity. I saw my father's face on the day he died. I saw the deep lines of worry around his eyes. He had looked at me from his hospital bed, trusting me completely, believing I was a good man. I remembered the exact feeling of the stolen cash in my pocket while I held his hand and promised him the ranch was safe. The guilt of that memory hit me harder than the physical pressure of the sand. I remembered the funeral earlier that day. I remembered standing by the open grave, watching the wooden coffin go down into the dirt. I had felt relieved. I had actually been happy that my father was dead, because it meant my secrets were safe. I had watched the preacher throw the first handful of dirt onto the box, and I had felt secure. Now, I was the one inside the box. I was the one buried under the dirt. The irony of my situation was a mental torture that tore my spirit apart. I tried to scream, but my mouth was full of sand. I tried to cry, but the dry dirt instantly absorbed any moisture, leaving my eyes burning and raw. I wanted to apologize. I wanted to tell my father I was sorry. I wanted to put the money back. I wanted to throw away the pills, but it was far too late. The time for apologies and choices was gone. The door to the physical world had closed, and I was locked on the outside. The concept of time completely disappeared in the sand. I could feel the rough texture of the grains against my face, my chest, my legs. It was a constant, abrasive friction that irritated every spiritual nerve I possessed. I realized that the physical pain I had used to distract myself from my guilt when I was alive was completely useless here. I could not outwork this pain. I could not fix this environment with a heavy metal wrench. My hands were empty. My skills were worthless. I could not tell if I had been buried for 10 minutes, 10 days, or 10 years. The darkness and the choking remained exactly the same, unchanging and relentless. The horrible realization of eternity began to settle over me. I understood that this was not a temporary prison. No one was coming to dig me out. My brother would eventually find my body next to the water pump in the desert. They would have another funeral. They would put my empty body into the ground, right next to my father. But my soul would remain here, trapped in this shifting, choking abyss forever. I realized that God had never sent me here out of cruelty. He had simply given me exactly what I demanded my whole life. I had lived my entire life demanding to be separated from truth. I had constantly chosen the dark over the light. I had chosen lies over honesty. I had built a fortress of dirt around my heart to keep God out. And in the end, God simply respected my choice. He allowed me to have the isolation and the burial I loved so much. The terrifying truth of hell is that it is a locked door, and the lock is on the inside. I had locked myself in here with my own decisions. I was completely naked before the reality of my own corrupt heart. The sand held me tight, an unyielding judge that offered no negotiation and no escape. I felt a deep, terrible thirst beginning to grow. It was not just a desire for physical water, it was a burning, desperate need for relief, for peace, for clean air. The dry sand was pulling every drop of spiritual life out of me, leaving me hollow and exhausted. I wanted to rest, but the pressure of the earth made rest impossible. The suffocating weight forced my mind to stay alert, completely focused on the agony of my situation. The worst part of the burial was the complete lack of hope. In the physical world, even in the darkest moments, there is always a tiny spark of hope that things might get better. The sun will rise, the sickness will pass, the debt will be paid. But in this dark place, hope did not exist. The atmosphere itself was made of pure despair. I knew with absolute certainty that my condition would never change. The sand would never stop choking me. The darkness would never lift. I was permanently ruined. I tried to think of anything good to distract myself from the horror. I tried to remember the smell of rain on the desert dirt, the sound of the horses, the taste of cold water. But the sand seemed to erase my good memories. It only allowed the bad memories to surface. I was forced to continuously consume the poison of my own sins. I had to swallow every lie, every theft, every selfish choice over and over again. My own evil had become my environment, and I was choking on it. I surrendered to the weight of the dirt, entirely broken and completely lost in the eternal dark. If this story is speaking to you, if something inside your heart is stirring, stay with me and take a moment to subscribe here to the channel. This is not just a video. This is an encounter with God. The oppressive weight of the sand suddenly disappeared. One moment I was completely crushed, choking on the dry dirt of my own burial, and the very next moment, the floor of the abyss simply gave way. I dropped straight down. The abrasive friction of the sand against my face was gone, replaced by a rush of hot, stale air. I did not fall for a long time. The drop was short and violent. I slammed hard onto a solid, unforgiving surface. The impact sent a shock wave of fresh agony through my spiritual body. I lay flat on my back, completely stunned. For the first time since leaving my physical body in the desert, my eyes were clear of the dirt. I opened them slowly, terrified of what I might see. There was no absolute darkness here. Instead, my vision was filled with a dull, sickening red glow. It was not a fire, and there was no sun. The light seemed to come directly from the environment itself. I carefully pushed myself up onto my hands and knees. The surface beneath me was jagged and completely uneven. I looked down and saw that I was resting on shattered rocks. The stones were sharp, broken, and dark red, looking exactly like dried blood. I slowly stood up and looked at my surroundings. I was standing at the bottom of a massive, terrifying canyon. The walls of the canyon rose up impossibly high on both sides of me, disappearing into a thick, dark ceiling of smoke and shadow. The stone walls were not smooth. They were covered in deep cracks, sharp edges, and horrible deformities. The entire place looked wounded. As soon as I stood up, the heat hit me. It was not like the heat of the New Mexico desert. The desert heat came from the sun above, and you could always find a small piece of shade if you looked hard enough. This heat was completely different. It radiated directly from the red rocks beneath my feet and from the towering walls around me. It was an invasive spiritual heat that burned from the inside out. There was absolutely no shade, no breeze, and no escape. The temperature was perfectly designed to cause maximum discomfort without ever destroying the soul. It was a calculated, deliberate torture. Almost immediately, a deep and terrifying sensation began to form in my throat. It was thirst. When I was alive and working on the ranch, I knew what it meant to be thirsty. I remembered the feeling of needing water after working all day in the sun. I remembered the empty plastic water bottle lying in the dirt next to my broken water pump. But the thirst I felt in this red canyon was infinitely worse than any physical dehydration. It was a complete and total deprivation of life. My mouth felt like it was filled with dry ash. My throat was tight and burning. Every time I tried to swallow, it felt like swallowing broken glass. But the worst part of the thirst was not physical. It was spiritual. I suddenly understood that the human soul was created to drink from the presence of God. While I was alive, I had experienced the grace of God every single day, even though I had rejected Him. I had experienced the cool rain, the taste of cold water, the feeling of peace, and the comfort of sleep. All of those things were small drops of God's goodness. In this canyon, every single drop of that goodness had been permanently removed. I was left completely dry, an empty vessel baking in an eternal oven. The ache for a single drop of peace was so intense it made my mind spin with madness. I started to walk. I did not know where I was going, but standing still on the burning rocks was impossible. The sharp stones cut into my feet, but I kept moving, driven by a desperate animal instinct to find relief. As I walked further down the canyon floor, the red glow grew slightly brighter, and I began to see shapes moving in the distance. At first, I thought they were just shadows cast by the jagged walls, but as I got closer, My heart sank into a new level of despair. They were other people. There were hundreds of them, scattered across the rocky ground and clinging to the sides of the canyon walls. They did not look like normal humans. They looked like gray, dried-out husks. Their bodies were hunched over, their movements slow and completely desperate. I stopped walking and watched them. They were all doing the exact same thing. They were dragging themselves across the sharp rocks, using their bare hands to scrape at the dry canyon walls. I watched one man nearby. He was on his knees, tearing at a large red stone with his fingers. His hands were ruined, but he did not stop. He was searching for moisture. He was looking for just one tiny drop of water hiding in the rock. He scraped a small flake of stone away, brought his empty hand to his mouth, and tried to consume it. He gained nothing. His face twisted in absolute agony, and then he immediately went back to scraping the rock. The horror of the scene paralyzed me. These people had been here for hundreds, maybe thousands of years, doing exactly the same thing. The madness of their repetition was terrifying. They knew there was no water in the rocks, but their spiritual thirst was so commanding that they could not stop searching. I looked around at the vast crowd of ruined souls. We were all trapped in the exact same location, suffering the exact same torment. But there was zero connection between us. There was no sympathy. There was no shared burden. If a drop of water were to suddenly fall into this canyon, I knew with absolute certainty that every single soul here would violently attack the others just to get it. The extreme selfishness that had guided my life on Earth was the only rule that existed here. We were together in the canyon, but we were all completely, eternally isolated in our own pain. I tried to look away from the scraping souls, turning my attention to the massive, dark walls of the canyon. I noticed that the deep cracks in the stone were entirely black. The red light of the canyon did not penetrate them. As I stared into one of the large cracks near me, I realized the darkness inside was not empty. I felt a cold, malicious presence looking back at me. There were entities living inside the walls. They did not show their faces. They did not jump out to attack me physically. They did not need to. Their method of torture was far more refined and cruel. I stood frozen as the first whisper slid out of the dark crack and entered directly into my mind. It was not a sound I heard with my ears. It was a thought forced violently into my consciousness. The voice was cold, sharp, and dripping with hatred. It whispered my father's name. I squeezed my eyes shut and covered my ears, trying to block it out, but the voice was inside my head. It began to recite the exact numbers of the bank accounts I had stolen from. It listed every single transaction, down to the final cent. It spoke the dates, the times, and the amounts. Then, a second voice joined the first, coming from a different crack higher up on the wall. This voice was mocking and cruel. It began to describe the small white pills I used to buy. It laughed at how weak I was. It described the pathetic way I used to hide them in my truck, terrified that someone would find them. More voices began to join in. The canyon walls were alive with them. They were not demons from ancient mythology. They were accusers. Their entire existence was dedicated to ensuring that I never forgot exactly why I was there. They knew every dirty detail of my life. They knew the thoughts I had kept completely secret from the world. One voice rose above the rest. It perfectly mimicked the sound of my father's voice on his deathbed. It repeated the last words he ever spoke to me. He had told me he loved me and that he trusted me to take care of the family. Hearing those words in this horrible place broke my spirit completely. The demons laughed at my pain. They told me I was a fraud, They told me my father would have hated me if he had known the truth. They told me I was the reason he died with a broken heart. The mental torture was absolutely relentless. On Earth, when the guilt became too heavy, I could take a pill. I could go to sleep. I could work on the ranch until I was too tired to think. I had 100 different ways to escape my conscience. But in the Canyon of Thirst, there were no escapes. I was forced to stand there, completely awake, feeling the full, crushing weight of reality. The demons did not invent any lies about me. That was the most painful part. Everything they whispered from the dark cracks was entirely true. I had handed them all the weapons they were using against me. My own life had provided them with the perfect ammunition. I fell to my knees on the sharp rocks. I did not care that the stones were cutting into my legs. The spiritual pain in my mind and the burning thirst in my throat were completely overwhelming. I looked up at the dark, smoky sky of the canyon, hoping against hope to see a break in the clouds. I wanted to see a single star. I wanted to see any sign of the physical world I had left behind. But the sky was solid black, pressing down on the canyon like a heavy lid. The reality of my permanent separation from God settled deeply into my core. I finally understood what the word lost truly meant. When you are lost on Earth, there is always a chance of being found. A road might appear, a person might walk by, the sun might rise and show you the way. But here, the concept of being found simply did not exist. I was erased from the presence of light. I was permanently deleted from the registry of the living. God had withdrawn his hand from this place entirely. I looked at my empty hands, trembling in the red light. These were the hands I had used to steal. These were the hands I had used to hide my addiction. I had thought I was so clever, building my secret life in the middle of the desert. I had completely ignored the constant warnings. I had mocked the testimonies of people who tried to tell me about the reality of eternity. I had been so proud, so arrogant, so completely blind. The heat of the rocks baked my skin, and the whispers from the walls continued to tear at my mind. The voices began to synchronize, repeating the same word over and over again. They called me a thief. They chanted it from the cracks, a steady, rhythmic beating of truth that vibrated through the stones. Thief, thief, thief. I could not defend myself. I had absolutely no arguments left. My entire life had been a carefully constructed defense attorney, always ready with a lie or an excuse to justify my actions. But the courtroom of hell does not accept lies. Only absolute truth exists here, and the truth was that I deserved exactly what I was getting. I was a thief, and my final theft was stealing my own soul away from the Creator who had made me. The thirst grew entirely maddening. My mouth was so dry I could not even produce saliva. I looked at the dark rocks next to my knees. The urge to act like the shadows around me became incredibly strong. My mind told me to start scraping. It told me to dig my fingers into the hard stone and search for a drop of water. I knew it was useless. I knew it was insane. But the deprivation was so absolute that logic began to fail. I reached my hand out slowly toward the jagged canyon wall. My fingers hovered over the dark red stone, trembling violently. I was slowly transforming into one of the empty husks, preparing to spend eternity tearing my own hands apart in a completely hopeless search for the peace I had freely rejected on Earth. My hand trembled just inches away from the dark red rock. My fingers were curled, ready to dig into the hard stone and scrape for water that did not exist. I was seconds away from joining the gray, empty souls around me in their eternal madness. The voices coming from the cracks in the walls were screaming at me to do it. they wanted me to completely lose my mind. They wanted me to surrender to the endless, useless repetition of tearing my own hands apart. But just before my fingernails touched the sharp stone, a sudden wave of absolute clarity hit me. I violently pulled my hand back. I stared at my shaking fingers in the dull red light. I realized what I was about to do. I was about to give up the very last piece of my humanity. I was about to become exactly what the demons were telling me I was. I took a step back from the canyon wall. My legs were incredibly weak. My foot slipped on the loose, broken rocks, and I lost my balance. I fell backward, sliding down a steep incline. The sharp stones tore at my spiritual body as I tumbled deeper into the canyon. I could not stop myself. I rolled over the jagged edges, sliding further and further down until I crashed into the absolute lowest point of the entire trench. This was a deep, narrow pit at the very bottom of the Red Canyon. The heat here was twice as intense as it was above. The ground was entirely covered in shattered stones that looked like broken glass. The walls narrowed in around me, making the space feel incredibly small and suffocating. I lay flat on my back on the burning rocks. I was completely defeated. I did not have the strength to stand up anymore. I did not have the strength to fight the environment. The deep, burning thirst in my throat was agonizing, but the pain in my heart was far worse. Lying there in the lowest pit of hell, stripped of all my money, my lies, and my pride, I finally stopped running. For my entire life on Earth, I was a man who always had an excuse. If I stole money, I told myself I deserved it because I worked hard. If I took drugs, I told myself I needed them because my life was stressful. I always pointed the finger at someone else or something else. I blamed the drought. I blamed my father's illness. I blamed the bad economy. I used all those excuses to build a thick wall around my conscience, so I would never have to feel guilty. But in this dark trench, the wall completely shattered. There was no one to blame here. The demons whispering from the rocks above me were entirely right. I looked up at the dark, heavy smoke filling the canyon sky, and I realized a terrible truth. I hated this place, but I belonged here. This barren, dry, ruined landscape was the exact image of my own soul. I had spent years turning my heart into a desert. I had pushed away every drop of love, honesty, and grace that God had tried to give me. I had chosen isolation. I had chosen theft. I had chosen deception. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. God did not throw me into this canyon. I had walked here on my own 2 feet. Every lie I told was a step downward. Every dollar I stole from my sick father was a step away from the light. God had tried to stop me. He had sent my mother to talk to me when I was younger. He had sent friends to warn me. He had even used the pain of my father's illness as a way to soften my heart, but I had ignored it all. I had laughed at the idea of eternity. I had mocked the people who tried to share their faith with me. I was arrogant, blind, and completely foolish. The deep sorrow that washed over me was heavier than the ocean of sand I had been buried in earlier. It was a pure, crushing grief. I was not just sorry because I was suffering in hell. I was deeply, genuinely sorry for what I had done. I remembered my father's hands. They were rough, strong hands that had worked the land his whole life. He had used those hands to provide for me, to feed me, to raise me. And in return, I had used my hands to rob him while he was dying. The shame of that betrayal burned hotter than the rocks beneath my back. I turned my face to the side, pressing my cheek against the sharp, hot stones. I did not care about the physical pain anymore. The spiritual conviction was tearing me apart from the inside. I realized that my sins were not just crimes against my family or crimes against the bank. They were crimes against the Creator who made me. I had taken the life He gave me and used it to destroy the people He loved. I was a disease on the earth. I was a parasite who only took and never gave. The voices from the cracks above started to laugh. They saw my complete brokenness, and they enjoyed it. They told me it was too late to feel sorry. They told me the gates were locked and my tears were useless. They whispered that God was disgusted by me and had forgotten my name forever. In the past, those whispers would have made me angry. I would have tried to defend myself. But lying in the dirt, I agreed with them. I spoke out loud for the first time in that horrible place. My voice was incredibly weak. My throat was so dry that the words sounded like dry paper rubbing together. I told the dark canyon that the demons were right. I am a thief. I am a liar. I am a terrible son. I deserve to be here. Saying those words out loud changed something. The atmosphere in the trench did not change. The heat did not stop. But something inside my spirit shifted. The massive, exhausting burden of pretending to be a good man finally fell away. I was naked, guilty, and completely exposed. But I was finally honest. The exhaustion of carrying a fake life was gone. I was just a broken sinner in the dirt, exactly where I belonged. I closed my eyes. The thirst was pulling my consciousness away. I knew I was going to fade into a permanent state of agony, but in that absolute darkness of my mind, a tiny memory sparked to life. It was a memory from just a few hours before my physical heart stopped beating. I remembered standing next to my truck after my father's funeral. I remembered my aunt walking up to me. She had a kind, soft expression on her face. She had tried to hand me a book. She told me it was a book of stories about people finding hope when they were completely lost. I remembered the exact title of the book. It had the name of Jesus written across the front cover. I had taken the book, smiled a fake smile, and thrown it carelessly onto the passenger seat of my truck. I had completely rejected the name of Jesus in the physical world. But down here, in the lowest pit of the Canyon of Thirst, that name suddenly felt entirely different. It did not feel like a religious word. It did not feel like a joke. It felt like a solid rock in the middle of a violent storm. It felt like the only clean thing in the entire universe. I knew I had no right to use that name. I had spent 40 years running away from it. I had mocked the people who worshipped him. I had broken every rule he ever created. I fully believed that if I called out to him, he would simply look away. He would agree with the demons and leave me in the rocks. I deserved his anger. I deserved his judgment. But my desperation was greater than my fear. I had absolutely nothing left to lose. I was an empty vessel, completely dry, completely shattered. I pushed my bloody hands against the sharp stones and lifted my head just a few inches off the ground. I opened my dry, burning eyes and looked up at the thick, black ceiling of the canyon. I did not have the strength to shout. I did not have the energy to make a long, complicated prayer. I did not try to negotiate. I did not promise to be a better person, because I knew I was entirely incapable of being good on my own. I brought everything I was down to one single, desperate breath. I opened my cracked lips and whispered the truth into the dark, burning air. I said I was sorry. I said I was completely ruined. And then, with the very last tiny spark of strength I had left in my soul, I called out the name of Jesus. I begged for mercy. I asked him to save me, not because I deserved it, but because I was completely destroyed without him. The sound of his name left my mouth and floated up into the heavy, toxic air of the canyon. It was the weakest, most pathetic sound I had ever made. As soon as the word left my lips, I dropped my head back down onto the sharp rocks. I closed my eyes, fully expecting the demons to laugh louder. I fully expected the heat to increase. I waited for the final, eternal darkness to swallow my mind completely. I had thrown my last hope into the empty void, and I lay perfectly still in the dirt, waiting for the punishment I knew I earned. I lay perfectly still on the sharp rocks at the bottom of the trench. I waited for the demons to attack me. I waited for the heat to burn my skin completely. I had finally spoken the truth about who I was, and I had called out the name of Jesus into the dark void. I fully expected my final punishment to begin right away. I kept my eyes closed tightly. I counted the seconds in my mind. I waited for the terrible voices to start laughing at me again. But the punishment never came. Instead, something completely impossible happened. The voices stopped. It was not a slow fade. It was an instant, absolute silence. The horrible whispers coming from the dark cracks in the walls simply vanished. The mocking laughter ended. The atmosphere in the deep trench changed entirely. The terrifying, heavy pressure of the demonic presence was instantly removed. It felt as though a massive, invisible weight had been lifted off my chest. I opened my eyes slowly. I was still lying on the broken rocks, but the terrible red glow was starting to disappear. The dark energy of the canyon was retreating. Then, I felt it. It was a physical sensation sweeping over my exhausted spiritual body. A cool breeze touched my face. In the canyon of thirst, where the air had been toxic and burning hot, a gentle, cold wind began to blow. It brushed against my dry skin. It was the most incredible feeling I had ever experienced. The heat that had been baking me from the inside out was instantly pushed away by this refreshing wind. The wind carried a scent that I had not experienced since I left the earth. It smelled exactly like fresh rain falling on dry dirt. It smelled like clean water. I took a deep breath. My lungs, which had been choked with sand and ash for what felt like an eternity, filled with pure, cool air. The burning pain in my chest immediately began to fade. I breathed in again, deeper this time, and the sweet air rushed through my body, bringing a tiny spark of life back into my empty soul. I looked up at the sky. The thick black ceiling of the canyon, made of heavy smoke and dark shadows, began to break apart. The darkness rolled away like a curtain being pulled back from a window. A beam of soft, bright light cut directly through the empty space. It was not the harsh, blinding light of the desert sun that had killed me on the ranch. It was a gentle, living light. It radiated pure warmth and absolute safety. The light traveled down the high walls of the canyon. As it moved, it completely erased the dark shadows. The terrible, deep cracks in the rocks where the demons lived were flooded with brightness. The light reached the bottom of the deep pit where I was lying. The sharp red stones around me, which had looked like dried blood, instantly turned entirely white under the glow. The entire environment was being transformed from a place of death into a place of peace. I saw a figure stepping out of the light. He was walking directly toward me. He did not float above the ground like a ghost. He walked right on the broken, sharp rocks of the trench. He had come down into the very lowest, dirtiest place in the spiritual world just to find me. Every time his foot touched the ground, the broken stones seemed to soften. The light surrounded him like a heavy cloak, but it did not hurt my eyes to look at him. As he got closer, the terrifying heat of the canyon completely died. The rocks beneath my back stopped burning entirely. The air became perfectly calm. I could not see his face clearly because the light surrounding him was so bright, but I did not need to see his face to know exactly who he was. The authority and the love radiating from him were unmistakable. It was Jesus. He had heard my desperate, pathetic whisper, and he had completely invaded hell to answer me. He stopped right beside me. I was lying in the dirt, covered in the spiritual filth of my own lies, my theft, and my terrible choices. I was the lowest form of existence. I felt a sudden rush of deep shame. It was not the toxic shame the demons had forced on me. It was the natural feeling of being completely dirty in the presence of someone who is completely pure. I was entirely unworthy to be near him. I tried to turn my face away. I tried to hide my dirty hands. I pulled my arms close to my chest. I expected him to look at me with disgust. I expected him to tell me how badly I had failed my father. I expected him to list my sins just like the demons had done. I waited for the judgment. But he did not speak a single word of condemnation. He looked down at me, and I felt a wave of absolute, unconditional love wash over my mind. He slowly reached his hand down toward me. I opened my eyes and looked at his hand. It was scarred. There was a deep, permanent mark right in the center of his palm. He had been wounded, too. He had suffered pain, rejection, and death. He understood exactly what it meant to be broken. He did not pull his hand back when he saw how dirty I was. He kept it extended, offering me a choice. I slowly reached my trembling, dirty hand up to meet his. My fingers were covered in the dark ash of the canyon and the dry sand of my addiction. I felt completely ashamed to touch him, but my desperate need for salvation was stronger than my shame. I placed my hand inside his hand. The moment our fingers touched, an explosion of pure, cold energy shot through my entire being. It was the living water. I cannot describe it perfectly in human words, but it felt exactly like a massive river of cold, clear water rushing directly into my soul. It flowed down my arm, into my chest, and straight into my heart. The agonizing, burning thirst in my throat was completely quenched in less than a single second. The dry, dead places inside my mind were instantly flooded with life. The deep spiritual dehydration that had made me want to scrape the rocks for moisture was gone. I drank the living water through his touch, and it completely satisfied every empty space inside of me. But the water did not just satisfy my thirst. It washed me. I physically felt the heavy layers of spiritual dirt being scrubbed away. The dry, choking sand of my lies, the dark ash of my hidden addiction, and the heavy mud of my theft were violently washed out of my spirit. It was a cleansing process that was incredibly powerful, but incredibly gentle at the same time. The water flowed through every memory, every thought, and every regret, cleaning the infection completely out of my soul. The terrible burden of guilt, the heavy mountain of shame that I had carried for years on the ranch, simply dissolved. It melted away like ice in warm water. I had spent my whole life trying to bury my shame in the dirt, but Jesus washed it away with a single touch. He took my horrible past and completely deleted it. I was clean. For the first time in my entire existence, I was completely, entirely clean. I began to cry. These were not the dry, agonizing tears of the canyon. They were real tears. They were heavy drops of absolute joy and unbelievable relief. I lay on the white rocks and cried like a small child. I wept for the years I had wasted. I wept for the pain I had caused my father. But most of all, I wept because of the incredible mercy I was receiving. I was a thief who deserved nothing but the dark sand, and the creator of the universe had just given me everything. He held onto my hand tightly. His grip was strong and completely secure. He gently pulled me up from the rocks. My legs, which had been too weak to stand just minutes ago, were entirely restored. The pain in my chest was gone. The exhaustion was gone. I stood up in front of him, bathed in the soft, pure light. I looked down at my spiritual body. The gray, dried-out skin was gone. I was whole. I looked around the canyon, the jagged walls, the dark cracks, and the terrifying shadows were completely gone. The environment had been entirely swallowed by the brilliant, peaceful light of his presence. The other souls, the demons, and the heavy smoke were nowhere to be seen. It was just me and Jesus, standing together in the light. I finally understood what true grace really means. Grace is not just a religious concept. Grace is receiving the exact opposite of what you deserve. I deserved to be left in the lowest pit of hell. I deserved the burning thirst. But Jesus stepped into my hell, took my dirty hand, and gave me his perfect peace instead. He did not ask me for an explanation. He did not demand a long apology. He simply offered me rescue, and when I accepted it, he made me entirely new. Before we move to the final part of my story, where I return to the physical world, I want to gently remind you to subscribe to the channel and stay with me until the very end. God wants to use the conclusion of this testimony to speak directly to your life. Do not miss it. The transition back into my physical body was completely violent. There was no gentle floating. I did not slowly open my eyes. 1 second, I was standing in the pure, brilliant light with Jesus, feeling the living water wash my soul completely clean. And the next second, a massive shock of electricity tore through my chest. My eyes snapped open. The pure, soft light of the spiritual world was instantly replaced by the harsh, blinding glare of the New Mexico sun. I was lying flat on my back in the hot dirt next to the broken water pump. A heavy, crushing weight slammed down hard on my chest. I heard a loud crack, and a sharp, physical agony shot through my ribs. I gasped violently, pulling a huge breath of hot, dusty air into my lungs. I started coughing uncontrollably. I rolled over onto my side in the dirt. Someone grabbed my shoulders and pulled me upright. My vision was completely blurred, but as my eyes adjusted to the intense sunlight, I saw my brother kneeling beside me. His face was covered in sweat and red dust. His eyes were wide with absolute panic. He had both hands on my shoulders, shaking me, shouting my name over and over again. I realized he had just performed chest compressions on me. He had broken 2 of my ribs trying to restart my heart. He found me lying out by the well, completely lifeless, and he had fought to bring me back. I looked at his face, and then I looked down at my own hands. They were covered in real, physical dirt. I touched my face. I touched my chest. I was solid. I was back inside my physical body. My brother pulled me into a tight hug, crying right there in the dirt. He told me he thought I was gone. He told me he had been doing compressions for several minutes with no response. I hugged him back, ignoring the sharp pain in my broken ribs. I was crying too, but my tears were entirely different from his. He was crying because he thought he almost lost his brother. I was crying because I knew I had just been rescued from eternal isolation. The physical thirst hit me immediately. My mouth was completely dry, and my lips were cracked from the desert heat. But it was only physical thirst. The deep, agonizing, spiritual deprivation that had tortured me in the canyon was entirely gone. My soul felt completely full. My heart felt incredibly light. The heavy, suffocating weight of my secret guilt, the massive mountain of shame I had carried for years, was completely missing. I was a broken man sitting in the dirt, but I was entirely free. My brother helped me stand up. My legs were weak and trembling. He practically carried me to his truck and put me in the passenger seat. He turned the air conditioning on high and handed me a warm bottle of water he had in the cup holder. I drank the water fast. It was warm and tasted like plastic, but it was the greatest thing I had ever consumed in the physical world. It reminded me of the living water that had just saved my soul. The drive to the hospital in the city took over an hour. My brother drove as fast as he could over the rough dirt roads, constantly looking over at me to make sure I was still breathing. I sat entirely still in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the barren landscape. The dry bushes, the cracked earth, and the empty sky looked exactly the same as they had a few hours ago, but everything had changed for me. I looked at the desert and remembered the terrible canyon of thirst. I knew with absolute certainty that the spiritual world was entirely real, and it was far more permanent than the rocks outside my window. When we finally arrived at the hospital, the doctors rushed me into the emergency room. They attached me to monitors, put an oxygen mask over my face, and started running a dozen different tests. They confirmed that I had suffered a massive, sudden cardiac arrest. They told my brother it was a miracle I survived out there in the heat for so long before he found me. They said my heart had stopped completely. They called it a medical miracle. I knew it was not a medical miracle. It was a divine rescue. I spent 4 days in that hospital room recovering. During those 4 days, the reality of my new life began to settle in. I knew that being saved from hell did not mean my physical problems magically disappeared. The stolen money was still gone. My addiction was still a reality I had to face. But the difference now was that I no longer wanted to hide. I hated the darkness. I wanted to stand entirely in the light, no matter how much it hurt my pride. On the second day, my brother came to visit me. He sat in the chair next to my hospital bed, looking relieved but exhausted. I asked him to close the door. I told him I needed to tell him something important. My heart started beating fast, but it was not the panic of a heart attack. It was the fear of finally telling the truth. I looked my brother directly in the eyes, and I confessed everything. I did not use any excuses. I did not blame our father, the drought, or the stress of the ranch. I told him about my addiction to painkillers. I told him exactly how much money I had stolen from our father's medical accounts over the last 2 years. I told him I was the reason the ranch was failing financially. My brother sat completely frozen. I watched the shock turn into confusion, and then turn into deep, painful anger. He stood up from his chair. He shouted at me. He asked me how I could do that to our father while he was dying. He asked me how I could stand at the funeral and pretend to be the perfect son. I let him shout. I let him express all his anger, because he had every right to be furious. I agreed with every angry word he said. I told him I was entirely guilty, and I was willing to face all the consequences. It was the hardest conversation of my entire life. It was much harder than working in the desert sun. But when it was over, and my brother walked out of the room to process the betrayal, I felt a profound sense of peace. I had finally stopped digging. The shovel was out of my hands. My secret was no longer buried in the dark. It was out in the open. The demons could never use it against me again. A few hours later, my aunt came to visit me. She was the one who had tried to give me the book of testimonies at the funeral. She walked into the room, saw my red eyes, and knew immediately that something major had happened. I told her the entire story. I told her about the heart attack in the desert, I told her about falling into the suffocating sand. I described the Red Canyon, the terrible thirst, and the demons whispering from the cracks in the rocks. Finally, I told her how Jesus walked into that terrible pit, took my dirty hand, and washed me clean. My aunt sat on the edge of my bed and wept with joy. She held my hand and told me she had been praying for me every single day for 10 years. She told me she knew I was hiding something dark, but she trusted God to bring it into the light. She opened her Bible right there in the hospital room and read to me about the grace of God. She explained that Jesus came specifically for the sick, the broken, and the lost. He did not come for people who pretend to be perfect. He came for people exactly like me. My recovery was long and difficult. When I was finally released from the hospital, I voluntarily checked myself into a strict rehabilitation center to overcome my physical addiction to the pills. The withdrawals were painful, but every time I wanted to give up, I remembered the terrible dry heat of the canyon. I remembered the feeling of the living water washing my soul. I pushed through the pain because I wanted to live a clean life in honor of the God who saved me. We had to sell a large portion of the family ranch to pay back the debts I had created. My reputation in our small town was completely ruined. People whispered about me when I walked into the grocery store. They knew I was the son who stole from his dying father. But I did not care about my reputation anymore. My pride had died in the desert. I gladly accepted the humiliation because it was the price of living in the truth. Over time, my brother and I slowly began to rebuild our relationship. It took years to earn his trust back, but God gave us the grace to forgive and move forward. Today, I am completely sober. I work an honest job, and I sleep perfectly at night. I do not hide anymore. I am speaking directly to you now, the person watching this video or reading these words. I do not know your name. I do not know what city you live in, but I know exactly what it feels like to carry a dark secret. I know what it feels like to build a perfect mask so the world will not see your shame. You might be stealing money. You might be hiding an addiction. You might be living a double life, terrified that someone will find out the truth. You are trying to bury your sins in the dirt, hoping they will disappear. I am warning you with everything inside of me. Nothing stays buried forever. The dirt will not protect you. When your physical heart stops beating, all your money, your reputation, and your clever lies will turn to ash. You will stand completely naked in the spiritual realm, and the things you thought you hid successfully will become your eternal prison. Hell is a place of absolute, unbroken truth. You cannot talk your way out of it. Do not wait until you are choking on the sand of your own choices. Do not wait until you are trapped in a canyon, desperate for a single drop of peace. The mercy of God is available to you right now, right where you are sitting. You do not have to clean yourself up first. You do not have to fix all your mistakes before you talk to Him. You just have to stop running. Take off the mask. Admit that you are broken. Speak the truth out loud. Call on the name of Jesus today. He is the only one who can walk into the absolute lowest pit of your shame, take your dirty hand, and wash you completely clean. Let Him give you the living water. Let Him change your life before it is too late.